Let me get to my next segment here, which is Chris Paul versus Scott Foster. And this really bubbled up, I believe it was Thursday night, a couple nights ago. Um, Towards the end of the second quarter, of Chris Paul fouled Kevin Durant there, and they went back and forth a little bit. And Chris Paul saying that Kevin Durant flopped, and Kevin Durant, of course, saying, "No, no, I didn't." But Scott Foster came over, and Chris Paul started arguing with Scott Foster there for a little bit back and forth banter, um, proceeding to have Scott Foster administer a tech to Chris Paul. Um, Pissing off Chris Paul even more and causing Chris Paul to call him a bitch. And obviously, that's not going to sit well with any ref. Um, Administering a second tech and getting Chris Paul ejected for only the seventh time in his career. But this has been a battle so far between these two. And Chris Paul basically alluding to the fact that, hey, it happened. This is something stemming from his son a couple years ago, where Scott Foster might have made a comment against his son. Um, a couple years ago, and they just been going back and forth where it's personal, and they basically just build up the animosity. This has been stemming from since the Hornets days, going into the Clippers days, going into the Rockets, the Suns, the OKC. Um, this is just crazy. Playoff record without Scott Foster. Playoff record without Scott Foster is 73-56. When Scott Foster is officiating in those games, he's 3-17. Chris Paul has only won one game, I believe his first one with Scott Foster. Way back with the Hornets. He's won one with the Clippers, and he was won one with the Suns, I believe, in the Western Conference Finals a couple of years ago when they made that run to the NBA Finals. And it's just crazy to think that this one ref has this much impact on a player's career to that standpoint, where it's looking that bad. Of course, you had Steve Javie and Rasheed Wallace in those texts back in the day when Rasheed was out there in Portland. Looking at Chris Paul, though, it seems like this is something that's staggering, alarming to this point, where it's not looking good anywhere. Like, I don't know how the NBA is sitting here and continuing to have Scott Foster officiate his games. At some point, you have to figure out that Chris Paul there's something here that shouldn't be here. And Chris Paul has stated many times, especially when he was with the Houston Rockets, that no one's paying to see Scott Foster. And that's completely true. And now, do I think that Chris Paul should sit there and escalate the situation with verbiage and stuff like that? That happens between players and refs, but the refs can't sit there and make it about them. And for Chris Paul to be a person of the NBA Players Association, president of the NBA Players Association, has brought it up numerous times to the referees around the league, to continue to have this follow him, to continue to have this stigma around Scott Foster, which seems to be true because of the record that points out there, these altercations that continuously happen year in, year out. How does the league continue to put Scott Foster on these games? And it's just alarming. And I'm not saying that any player deserves any special treatment, but when something is this staggering, something has to be investigated or looked at to be like, why is this such way? Why is it everything to everything else positive, a positive record without you officiating? And now when you officiate Chris Paul, so it seems like there's always a brush up. There's always something happening. And now it leads to an ejection, which desperately affected the Golden State Warriors there against the Suns, and who's already depleted. And you're just looking at it and saying, at what end does this get resolved? And it shouldn't be that complicated. Stephen A. Smith said it on First Take that Scott Foster shouldn't be officiating any Chris Paul games, and I agree. He shouldn't. Like, it's that alarming. You keep having these brush-ups, and it's just foolish. And the league, not only does Chris Paul think this about Scott Foster, the NBA players around the league, The Athletic did a survey just at the end of last season, I believe, going into the playoffs, who's the worst official in the NBA, and 25% said Scott Foster. Tony Brothers and a couple others came up, but significantly lower percentage. The league doesn't like Scott. The NBA players don't like Scott Foster. And it seems like his biggest rival is Chris Paul. And it seems like Scott Foster's winning this battle, continuously being able to officiate his games, continuously able to affect these games with technicals and stuff like that and having a short leash. And I think of the officials, there's a combination there. Of course, the officials have a tough job to do on a nightly basis. It's not easy. You're going to miss some calls, but more often than not, you can make it right. You can do the right thing. And it seems every single step of the way against Chris Paul, it's not going his way. And it's like, it looks pretty bad for the referees around the league and the league. I think the officiating has been sometimes they let the players play, which I think they should do on a nightly basis. And then sometimes they're really ticky-tack fouls. They don't know what to call. They're being less aggressive and things of that nature. And it seems like Scott Foster has a short leash for Chris Paul, which is ridiculous in my opinion and should be looked at desperately. Moving on to